Chapter 2. The long black road to Adlaz. In illimitable darkness a spark glowed unlived, and the soul of Polaris awoke and once more knew it was a soul. The silence of oblivion was broken by a roaring as of 1,000 mighty rivers torrenting on their courses far underground. One by one the man endured the tortures that those must endure who come back from the claim of the sea. Slowly and with exquisite agony came the consciousness that his body still lived, an agony so keen that he fain would have wrenched himself free of the flesh and departed it. Fire, liquid and intolerable, raced through his every vein and artery. His head, no longer tenanted by a brain, it seemed, was a vast and empty cavern through which wild winds moaned. An age it was in seeming that the soul fought its way through travail, back to command of the faculties it had quitted until it had regained the mastery of its two provinces, the brain and the body. The fiery rivers were quenched. The winds ceased their roaring. With a groan and a shudder the son of the snows once more took up the burden of living. Weak and dizzy and deathly sick, he opened his eyes. He lay on a soft bed of furs in a small and swaying room. Almost at his elbow he heard the splash of waves against metal walls. Above him, an expression of sympathy and concern on his ruddy face bent the red-haired stranger. When he saw the eyes of Polaris quiver open, the man smiled, a rare and winning smile.
"Now, by the four rivers,"
he said,
"I am glad to see you return to the living. So long did you tarry in the beyond that I thought that I had lost you."
For a moment Polaris gazed into that rubicund countenance in bewilderment, but for a moment only. With the floods of life came memory. He tried to spring to his feet, but the struggle in the water and the nausea of his returning vitality had sapped the strength from him. He fell weakly back. The look he bent upon the stranger was poignant with its question.
"Rose, the rosemaid? Where is she?"
He gasped, wresting the words out painfully. With a graceful gesture, the stranger drew to one side and pointed across the room.
"Your lady? She is there,"
he said. On the other side of the room, only a few feet away, was another couch, similar to the one on which Polaris had found himself. Rosimer lay upon it. The oilskins she had worn were in a crumpled heap upon the floor. Her gown, sodden with sea water, clung to her limbs. A careful hand had partly covered her with the folds of a robe of soft, dark furs. The coils of her long, chestnut hair, dishevelled and damp, had fallen about her face and neck. Her long lashes lay upon her cheeks. Her lips were slightly parted. One arm hung down from the edge of the couch, its hand relaxed and open, the fingers limp. Long and earnestly Polaris looked at her. He could see only her profile. Her face was very white and still, outlined there against the furs. The light went out of his tawny eyes, and he set his teeth and turned his face to the wall. The sob that arose in his throat was wrung from the depths of a spirit sorely stricken. Now death were welcome indeed.
"Grieve not so,"
the stranger said hastily.
"She is not dead, and I am a fool to bring such right upon you. She did but swoon when you yourself were overlong in returning to the realm of the living. Here."
He passed an arm under the shoulders of Polaris, and assisted him to rise and cross to the other couch. Swaying like a drunken man, the son of the snows bent and touched the wrist of the girl with his fingers. When he felt the tides of the life-blood leaping through the warm flesh, a joy welled up within him that was akin to pain in its throbbing. Come what might, his lady lived, and once again there was light in his world. He laid his cheek against hers, and he was near to tears in his weakest. Presently he raised his head, and for the first time gave a thought to his surroundings. The room he was in was shaped like the quarter of a circle. The couch on which he had lain was along the curved side of the room. Under the wall was of steel or iron, against which he could hear the lapping of waters. At each end, where the cabin narrowed to the points of its arc, were cabinets carved of polished woods. At the side where the girl lay the wall was of wood, also, and was pierced by a small door. A number of garments hung from pegs in the panelling. Near to the door, in a golden sheath, swung a heavy, short-bladed sword. Overhead was a crisscross of slender wooden beams, and in the midst of them was set a translucent globe of porcelain or clouded glass, through which a strong light was shed, light that was almost as clear in its quality as that of day. At the sight of those cross-beams, Polaris's memory stirred quickly. Where had he seen such before? He had it. It was just such a lattice-work that had made a raft for the stranger when he had found him floating in the sea. What was the meaning of it? The screaming fury of the tempest, with its menace to all that he held dearest, the terrible moments when the Minnetonka went roaring down to ruin, the struggle in the sea, the agony of resuscitation, the grim fear that had choked him when he saw his dear lady lying there so pale and still, all those transitions had shaken even the strong will and cool brain of the son of the snows. He shook his head impatiently, as though the fog through which his mind groped were a physical fact, to be dismissed so. Here at his side was the living answer to the questions that now trooped thick and fast, the man who had promised him life on the sinking deck of the cruiser and who had made that promise good.
Where are we, and who and what are you?
Polaris asked him. The answer was as ready as it was surprising.
We are under the sea in the captain's cabin of a Fadim in the navy of the great king, Elar. And I.
He bowed slightly and smiled.
I am the captain Alaric the Red, also of the navy of the great king, but a prison without a Fadim to command.
So unusually circumstanced from his very birth had been the life of Polaris Ionas that he long before had accepted and made his own the philosophy which the Prince of Denmark taught to Horatio. Things that the ordinary man would scoff at and reject as preposterous had been the incidents of his everyday existence. So now the extraordinary declaration of him who named himself Alaric the Red did not move him to any great show of surprise. Instead, there came to him the sorrowful vision of the good great cruiser, sundered and wrecked and going down to the ocean's bed, bearing with her many a man whom he had been glad to call his friend, men who twice had risked their lives in the Antarctic perils that others might live. With that picture in his mind came a thought that drove all the mist from his brain and made it burn with a sense of outrage and anger. He snapped himself erect, and with hands clenched and blazing eyes looked down on Alaric.
The breaking of a good ship yonder came not from within, but from without,
he said sternly.
That great ray of strange light that cut out like a knife was some devil's device of these that you call Fadines. Is it not true?
Over the face of Alaric passed a shadow that made it sad, but his eyes were steadfast and unflinching.
It is true,
he answered.
I would have prevented it if I could have. Your ship has gone the way of all others which have come to the coast of Meronica. Is it, then, the custom of your great king so to greet strangers who come to his shores?
Asked Polaris.
Such have been the orders of the king of Meronica,
replied Alaric.
Many a long century has rolled into the past since any ship, save the Fadimes, cast anchor in the harbour of the city of Adlaz. It is the law. It is so writ upon the sacred column. But it is a bad law. An hour ago we had not guessed of the existence even of this land of Meronica of yours, with its city of Adlaz and its rule of death in the sea,
said Polaris.
All that we asked was to go our ways in peace and the safe journey to America. Now, because of the evil law of an evil land, a great ship's company is food for the fishes. You say well that it is a bad law. And, hark you, Alaric the Red, I count the reckoning between this King Bellar of yours and me as both long and heavy. I do not know how it will fall about, or when, but my heart tells me that some time I shall make settlement of that score.
Rose and Mare stirred and moaned, and Polaris turned to her. He knelt again at the side of her couch and chafed her hands. Running his fingers through his red hair, Alaric looked down at Polaris. A strange light shone in the blue eyes of the captain, and over his face spread a crafty and satisfied smile. He nodded his head as though a thought had come to him that pleased him much.
Yourself and the lady here are not the only ones saved from the ship,
he said at length.
What? There are others that life?
Polaris asked quickly.
Who, and where are they? In the opposite cabin of the Fadim is the old man Zenas,
Alaric replied.
And with him is a large and fat young man who made all of the jokes at the table on the ship. And in another Fadim is the captain, Everson, and the two you saved from Sardanes, the giant Minos and the dark and splendid lady, Memine. What know you of Sardanes?
Polaris asked.
And how comes it that you speak our English speech, now that your tongue is loosened?
Alaric smiled.
Though my tongue was idle on your ship yonder, my ears were not,
he said.
Nor were my eyes, and they gathered me much information. I know that you, whom they call the son of the snows, have lived a strange life and looked upon many wonders. But they are as nothing to the wonders which you are to see presently, and I, Alaric the Red, shall show them to you.
He laughed soundlessly.
But the language, where learn you the English tongue?
Polaris asked again.
Surely it is not spoken in this Meronica, this land whereof no man has ever heard. Many years ago I learned it from the lips of a slave. He, too, had been taken from the deck of a ship which was sunk by the Fatims,
was the answer of Alaric. He regarded Polaris keenly. Nor was that reply without its effect.
Slaves,
Polaris cried.
Is this another of the laws of this land of yours, to make slaves of strangers? It is the law of the great king.
Alaric said.
Few such have been taken alive, but they have lived as slaves or died on the sands of the arena to make sport for the people of the great games which are a part of the Feast of Years.
For a moment, even Rosamere was forgotten. Polaris looked up at the Meronican captain with a blaze in his eyes that boded little of submission to the laws of Bellar, the king. When he spoke, it was very quietly.
Law or no law, back shall break, and spirits set out on their journeys before I shall become slave to any man. But the maid here,
interposed Alaric,
would you bring due upon her as well as upon yourself? Be not so rash, my brother. All things come to him that waits, was the saying of that slave from whom I learned your tongue, O'Connell. He did call his name. I know not if his saying be true. I know he waited many long years, and death came to him.
Polaris shook his head slowly.
There is little cheer in these words of yours, Alaric the Red,
he said.
and I do not know why you should call me brother for whom you foretell a life of slavery. But these things are bridges to be crossed when met.
He turned back to Rosamir.
Have you such a thing as wine on this ship?
He asked.
This wound is long in passing.
Again the Red Captain regarded the broad back with satisfaction and smiled his craftful smile. He stepped to the end of the cabin, and from the cabinet there fetched a tall glass flagon, bound with golden filigree work, and a slender, twisted goblet. The liquor which he poured from the flagon was cherry red, and sent forth a pleasing aroma.
Here is of the best in Meronica,
he said.
Trust the captain of the Fadimes to know it.
Lifting Rose's head on his arm, Polaris held the goblet to her lips and let the red wine trickle down. As he did so, the door of the cabin was opened from without. A man thrust his head through and shouted to Alaric in a strange, though not a musical tongue. The captain answered him a word or two, and the door was closed again. Polaris saw that the man wore armour of a pattern similar to that of Alaric, and that, like the captain's, his face was ruddy. But his hair was black, and he wore a short, curling beard. While the door was opened, the purr of smoothly running machinery could be heard, and with it a steady hissing, bubbling noise, like that of escaping steam. Rose sat up suddenly and glanced around her with frightened eyes. She threw her arms around Polaris's neck and clung to him.
You lay so still,
she sobbed.
I thought that you were dead. But you're alive, alive.
Alaric bent forward and spoke hurriedly.
We are nearing the harbour of the city of Adlaz,
he said.
I do not know when I shall have opportunity to talk with you again. But if it be not soon, wait, and accept with patience, even though it shall try you sorely, all that shall happen. Just now you asked me why I called you brother. You saved me from the sea. On the ship yonder you and the old man Inez, and another whom I grieve that I could not save, tended me when you thought that I was near to death. And after, when your sailors murmured, and they would have cast me into the sea, you guarded me from harm. All those things I know and shall not forget. That is why I call you brother. And back of all of those things there is still another reason, of which I hope to tell you soon. I learned from the slave O'Connell that the shake of the hands between men is a bond of friendship. Will you shake my hand, my brother?
Polaris took the proffered hand in a grip that made its owner wince.
It seems that despite the laws of Bela, the king, I have found a friend,
he said.
I shall try to be patient, Alaric. Hold your hand from anger,
enjoined the Red Captain earnestly. Even
though you be put to serve as a slave in the mines of Bela, and instruct your companions that they do likewise. Bright days are coming upon Meronica, and I promise you faithfully that you shall play a great part in them.
He broke his speech suddenly. Again the door swung open. Somewhere in the depths of the Fadime a bell rang clearly. The noise of the mechanism ceased. The black-bearded man who had thrust his head into the cabin before stood in the doorway and beckoned to Alaric.
Remember,
warned the captain as he passed Polaris.
Patience and the strong heart of yours shall carry you far before your sun goes down.
He went out and the door closed after him.
What does he mean, with his talk of slaves in the mines and all those strange names?
Rosamir asked wonderingly.
Where are we?
Polaris told her all that he had learned from the captain. She heard him with wide eyes.
You a slave?
She cried.
Oh, no, not that. Is it to be like this all our lives, to see happiness just ahead of us, but never reach it? Fate cannot be so cruel. Think what you have endured. And now to be slave here in this terrible foreign land.
Perhaps fate was listening then, fate, who can be both cruel and kind, sordid and splendid, according to her whim. She had played many strange tricks on this man, but she now decreed that he should never serve the King Bel-Ar as a slave. Soon after the departure of Alaric, the door of the cabin was opened again, and an armoured man entered. It was he of the black beard, whom Polaris rightly guessed to be the captain of the Fadime. With him came 3 other men unarmoured, who evidently were members of the crew of the craft. Sturdy, black-haired fellows these were, dressed alike in loose, necklace blue tunics of some woven material, with elbow sleeves and belted in at the waist. Beneath the tunics they wore long, close-fitting nether garments like the hose of the Middle Ages, only these were both hose and trousers too. On their feet were shoes of soft leather, the tops of which came nearly to their knees, and which were laced with gay-coloured cords. Their heads were covered with flat caps of cloth which resembled somewhat the tam-o'-shanters of the Scots. Those, too, were dyed in bright colours. With a motion of his arm the captain indicated to Rose and Polaris that they were to leave the cabin. The girl still was weak from her swoon, and tottered when she stood, and her garments were wet and bedraggled. Polaris wrapped her in the robe of furs with which Alaric had covered her, and lifted her in his arms. As he did so, one of the sailors spoke harshly and snatched at the robe. He was clumsy, and his fingers caught in Rose's unbound hair and pulled it so that she winced. Polaris set the girl down and in the same motion spun on his heel and struck the man under the ear. While it was for the Maronican sailor that the son of the snows, quick as was his anger at the affront to the girl, remembered the counsel of Alaric. Even as he struck, he remembered, and he opened his hand, else the stroke, directed by his mighty thews, had ended all things for the sailor. As it was, the blow partly lifted the man from his feet and shot him sprawling through the oven door to fall heavily outside. From its peg on the wall the captain caught down the short-bladed sword and tore it from the sheath. At a word from him, his two remaining men plucked knives from their belts and closed in. Prospects of battle cleared the last of the numbness from the limbs of Polaris. He thrust Rosemary behind him. He ran his eyes hastily over the cabin in search of a weapon, but saw none which would serve him. In another instant he would have sprung barehanded against the Maronican steel. At that juncture a voice cried out, and Alaric the Red stepped over the fallen sailor and entered the cabin. Whatever may have been the failings of the Red captain, slowness in action was not one of them. Gripping the two crouching sailors, each by the belt from behind, he tugged so mightily that their feet flew from under them, and they sat hard on the cabin floor. With a cat-like leap, Alaric reached the side of the captain of the Fadim and struck the sword from his hand. As the blade clanged on the floor, Alaric set his foot across it. Then, and not until then, did he seek to learn the trouble's cause.
What now, comrade?
He said to Polaris.
Do you then court this so soon?
But when he heard of the sailor's action, he nodded his red head.
So would I have done,
he said shortly. He turned on the other captain and spoke to him sternly in the Maronican tongue. Almost choking in his rage, the commander answered him in sneering tones, and with a shrug of his shoulders stalked from the cabin. The sailors slunk after him. Alaric watched their departing backs with a hard and level stare.
Dalo grows insolent,
he said.
He thinks because I have had the misfortune to lose a Fadim that I shall get no pretty welcome from Belar. Maybe he is right. Belar loves not to lose his ships. Oh, well.
He, too, shrugged his shoulders, and then he smiled.
And you, my brother?
He shook his finger at Polaris.
Unless you learn to curb that fine spirit of yours, I need to be no prophet to foretell what shall befall you. But come, let us leave this place. The air of it grows foul.
With Rose in his arms, Polaris stepped from the cabin and gazed curiously about him. He stood in a long gallery, or corridor, some 9 feet wide by 30 in extent. It was lighted brightly by a number of globes similar to that in the cabin. The flooring was of wood, the ceiling of steel. Opposite him was the door of another cabin. A few feet along the corridor ahead of him, toward the prow of the Fadim, the floor was pierced to admit a large poster beam, which thrust up through it and disappeared through another opening in the ceiling of the gallery. Around the beam spiraled a slender winding stair of yellow metal. Alaric led on toward the bow. As he passed the stairway, Giannis saw that it led to a small tower-like structure above. A glance through the opening in the floor showed him another gallery, or deck, below, and he had a glimpse of a massive mechanism in shafting. It was the engine room of the Fadim into which he looked. Near the prow, the flooring was cut away again to allow the passage of what seemed to be a pillar of solid, yellow glass, as large around as the body of a man. As they passed the second pillar by, Alaric struck it lightly with his palm.
There is what brought death to your good ship, my brother,
he said.
It is the secret of the power of the navy of Belar.
At the end of the corridor was an open door. Beyond it was a small chamber and another door. The chamber was constructed entirely of steel. Both of its doors were circular in shape, and they were fitted with valves and bars which made them resemble the breech blocks of enormous cannon. From beyond the second door came the sound of the splashing of waves and the hum of many human voices. Alaric passed through the chamber. At the outer door he paused and gave Polaris a hand with his burden. A breeze of salt air fanned their faces. Through the door Polaris saw an expanse of blue water alight with shafts of sunshine, for the rain had ceased, and the line of a rocky wall.
The harbour of the city of Adlaz,
the Red captain said. They stood on a metal deck 6 feet square on the extreme prow of the Fadim. From the deck a narrow, swaying gangplank reached to the edge of the quay that was built of massive blocks of masonry, alongside of which the Fadim was moored. At their right was the tossing blue and white of a harbour large enough to have given shelter to the ships of all the navies of the world, could they have come to it. Nearly 3 miles in width and length it lay, the whole girt round by the ring of a lofty mountain wall, in which on the seaward side there was not a notch or a break. 200 feet up from the water's edge the sheer cliffs towered, their faces smooth and precipitous. It was more a lake than a harbour that held the navy of Belar. Later the Americans learned that its only entrance from the sea was a natural tunnel many feet below the level of the water, through which the Fadines passed out and in. The harbour was a giant cup or crater of a volcano, ages quenched. Along the wharves of stone and anchored in the lake rot the fademes of the Moronican fleet, each one resembling nothing so much as a monstrous goldfish carrying a glass tower on its back. Gold they were, indeed, and they shimmered and glittered in the sunlight as only gold can glitter. Like immense, flattened globes, the fademes were fashioned, globes 40 feet through their lengthened axes, and drawn to points at their stems and sterns. Where the dorsal fin of a fish projects from its spine, each fademe bore a small, round deckhouse with ribs of metal and sides of polished crystal. Yes, the harbour of Adlaz was very like a vast bowl with many goldfish. The fleet of fademes must have numbered 150. But they were far from being the harmless toys of children, these golden ships of the underseas. Deadly in spine, each fademe bore a small, round beast sent forth on cruel errands. On the dancing surface of the lake, and in and out among the gleaming fademes plied a number of small open boats, driven by oarsmen, and here and there in the anchorage were scattered undersea craft of a make smaller by half and more slender than the fademes. These were called marizals. Back of the quays and the wharves was a line of low buildings of black and red stone, well constructed, with doors of wood and glass windows. Except that their architecture was quaint and ran much to carve faces of men and beasts, interspersed with squat domes and spires, they might have been the warehouses of some well-to-do port of the old world. An open space, a number of acres in extent, lay beyond the buildings and reached to the frowning face of the cliff wall. The wall itself was pierced by a broad arch or tunnel wide enough for a squadron of cavalry to have ridden through it abreast, and so high that a galleon's masts would not have touched its vaulted roof. Above the centre of the arch, and carved in the rock of the cliff side, was a great round face, many feet across. It was a piece of sculpture to crook the fingers of a miser, for it was covered with beaten gold, so that it resembled a rising sun. That semblance was heightened further by long shafts or rays which extended from the face across the surface of the rock in all directions. They, too, were of gold. Work of a master sculptor, it was, who had guided his chisel in bold, strong strokes. The features were noble, but the smiling lips were cruel, and there was cruelty in the golden eyes which looked down on the golden ships in the harbour. All these things Polaris saw from the forward deck of the Fademe, and more. The quays and the core were black with people. At one side of the archway was drawn up a line of horsemen clad in steel armour. In the midst of the throng in the court a man in a yellow tunic and cap was cleaving his way through the press toward the wharf on a big black horse. As he crossed the swaying plank to the wharf with Rosemary in his arms, Polaris heard a great cry of wonder go up from the crowd. In a moment he learned that it was not the appearance of the strangers that had caused the outcry. It was the return of Alaric the Red, who had long been given up as lost. Evidently the Red Captain was a popular man in his land. People crowded around him and clapped him on the back and gave him words of welcome home. Greetings none the less hearty for that they were tinged with a note of apprehension for his future welfare, which even Polaris could sense, though he understood no word of it all. Down from his horse sprang the man in the yellow tunic and enfolded Alaric in a mighty embrace.
Ah, old Red Bear, it is good for the eyes to see you once again. We had thought the fishes had you, but...
And he lowered his voice.
You will have to think of a pretty tale to tell to Belar. He raves at the loss of a Fademe. That he does,
answered Alaric.
But I am good at the telling of tales, as you know. Besides, I have with me a matter of a small sack, which was not lost with the Fademe, and which shall make the eyes of his queen to glisten. So mayhap I shall find forgiveness.
The other ran his eye over Polaris and Rose.
What more slaves?
He asked.
All is already as broad and 3, and one of them a giant. Yes, Brunnar, more slaves.
Alaric's face grew sober.
Poor souls. My heart is heavy for them, for they did save my life out yonder on the sea, and treat me kindly. Here, Old Bear, take you my horse and ride unto Adlaz,
said Brunnar.
I have business here. I will come on anon through the canal in a marzal. And, if the hand of Belar lie not too heavy upon you, there will be a rare night tonight, or a rare night, Old Bear.
Laughing, he tossed the reins to Alaric and disappeared in the crowd. From the stern of the Fademe they had quitted sounded a high-pitched voice in notes of vituperation. Alaric looked back. The Captain Daedalus stood on the rear deck of his vessel. When he saw Alaric turn, he shook his clenched fist at the Red Captain. With a laugh, Alaric flung back a remark of such import that it made Daedalus dance upon his deck with rage.
Now there's a fool,
grumbled Alaric,
who may be troublesome. I have the best of him this time, though. Back to sea patrol he goes. And there is a maid in Adlaz town, a sweet and comely maid, for love of whom he's well nigh witless. I just did tell him that I'd comfort her in his absence.
The captain tossed his head and laughed his soundless laugh. Bidding a lad hold his horse, Alaric led Polaris and Rose into one of the buildings near the end of the wharf. There, under a guard of sailors, they found old Zenas, the two Sardanians, Everson and Brooks. Lacking an interpreter, such as Alaric, these others were in sole bewilderment. The stunning blow of the loss of the Minnetonka had cast them in a depth of gloom, which the appearance of Polaris and Rosamara and the few explanations they were able to give did little to lighten. Everson, especially, was like a man distraught. Even the scientific zeal of Zena's right for once was quenched, and he met the marvels about him with a listless eye. Under orders from Alaric, men fetched from stables near the quays a long, low car, to which 2 span of horses were attached, and the Americans were bidden to take their places in it. Wild and reckless drivers these Moronicans were. 2 of them climbed into the car, turned their horses' heads toward the great archway, and whipped them into a gallop. With a yell, the crowd parted. The hoofs of the horses rang on the stones of the paved courtyard. As they passed from the court into the tunnel, the line of steel horsemen came clattering after them. Alaric rode at the side of the car. At intervals in the walls of the tunnel were set translucent globes like those in the Fadim, which shed a strong white light along the way. The flooring was paved and smooth. For perhaps 5 minutes the cavalcade thundered through the passage in the rock, and then it emerged again into the light of day. Ahead stretched a long, wide roadway, paved from side to side with blocks of black stone, fast embedded in a cement of the same hue. At both sides of the road were low walls, and beyond the walls were handsome mansions and grounds, where fair trees tossed their greenery and bright flowers bloomed amid a wealth of shrubbery. From the splendid and fragrant lawns men and women looked forth as the car whirled past, and children left their play to run to the walls and stare wide-eyed at the strangers. Most of the men were garbed as had been those of the Fadim's crew and also the crowd at the harbour, in loose, belted tunics and hose, but finer in texture and more showy in colouring than those of the commoner sort. Some of the old men wore flowing gowns. The women and children were clad in short kirtles. Everywhere was a riot of colour. The garments of the people were gay with many tints and hues. The grounds were flecked with flowers. The dwellings, all of which were built of stone, made their brave show of colours too. The quarries from which the masonry was cut yielded white and black and red stone, and in their construction work the builders had varied them pleasingly. From the tunnel's mouth at the base of the ancient hill, the long, black road sloped up gradually. Far ahead loomed the walls and domes of a great city. Alaric rose in his stirrups and pointed to where they were outlined against the sky.
Yonder lies Adlaz, chief city of the children of Ad,
he cried. Midway in their course to the city, the shouting drivers pulled their horses suddenly to one side of the road, and the riders of the escort scattered to right and left to leave a clear passage. From far up the wonderful street sounded the clash and clatter of pounding hoofs in desperate haste. But no horse it was that galloped so madly from Adlaz town to the sea, but a giant, bronze-coated bull. On he came, head down and tail aloft, his hoofs striking fire from the smooth, hard rock of the roadway. At intervals he gave voice to a deep-throated bellow. He was still 300 yards from the car when Rosamara screamed out in horror.
"Oh, the child! Save the child!"
she cried. From one of the mansions farther up the street, a child had strayed, a baby girl, a fragile, black-haired little thing, not more than 5 years old. Shrieking with laughter, she had eluded her mother and run out through the gateway to the centre of the road. Halfway across the pavement, she slipped and fell. Down the street on thundering hoofs came the great bronze death. Upsetting one of the drivers in his haste, Polaris leaped down over the wheel of the car. Scarcely had his feet touched the roadway when Minos, the Sardanian, was down behind him. Snatching a short spear from the hand of one of the steel riders, the son of the snows bounded up the street to meet the bull, going at a speed which few living things could have equalled. Over his shoulder he called to Minos.
"Care for the child, Minos, leave the beast to me."
Just beyond, where the baby girl lay, he met the furious mass of charging flesh. The little red eyes of the oncoming monster saw the man in its path, and for an instant the bull seemed to halt in its stride, and its hoof slid on the smooth pavement. Then it lowered its head still farther and charged on with a roar. From the tail of his eye, Jonas saw the Sardanian snatch the baby from the perilous path and leap to one side. Behind them the red captain, shouting and cursing, alone of all the troop of riders, strove to urge his affrighted horse forward.
"Hold! Hold!
He shouted in English.
Let the beast go!"
Even had he heard, Polaris would have been little minded to let the bull go free. It was plain that the animal was mad. A bloody froth dripped from its jaws as it ran. Behind the son of the snows, right where the bull was headed, were his friends, and among them one who meant more to him than all of the rest of the world. Directly in the path of the lower torrents, that were coming on with the power of a mighty battering ram, Polaris stood. Then he sprang sidewise, turning as he leaped. So narrowly did he time the onset that the shoulder of the bull grazed his knee. As the huge body passed him, the man drove the short spear home behind its shoulder, guiding the steel with the strength of arm and the keenness of eye that had helped him to survive through the long years when combat with the beasts of the wild was a part almost of his daily existence. The stroke was true. So deeply did the steel spear bite that its shaft was wrenched from the hands of Polaris, and he was pitched on his side on the pavement. Unhurt, the man was up in an instant, but his work was done. That bull would charge no more. He lay dead at the side of the roadway, his tongue thrust out, his eyes glazing, and his lifeblood making a pool on the stones. The Maronican spear was set fast in his heart. Hardly was Polaris on his feet again when the armoured horsemen rode down on him with lifted spears, cursing him in their own tongue. Alaric had conquered his horse, and he now interposed to prevent another struggle which would have been all too one-sided. For, weaponless as they were, the 3 other American men clambered down and ran to the aid of Polaris. Minos, who had returned the child to her mother, who knelt half fainting in a gateway, was the first to reach his side. Though he bore no weapon, the giant Sardanian squared his mighty figure and made ready to withstand the onset of horse and steel. Polaris leaped to the side of the fallen bull and tore the spear from its body. Then he turned on the horsemen. He could not guess the cause of their sudden anger, but he, too, was ready. Before blows could be struck, Alaric thrust his horse into the open space between the friends and the Maronican riders. By dint of persuasion, interlarded with not a few threats, he induced his followers to forego their hostile intentions.
"Ye fools,"
he shouted.
"would you cheat Bel-Ar of the terrible vengeance he is sure to take, and have a part of it fall back on you for balking him?"
When he had quieted his men, the captain turned gloomily to Polaris.
"My brother, your doom is sealed, indeed,"
he said.
"This is one of the sacred bulls from the temple of Shamar, the great sun that you have slain. When one of these goes mad, as did this one, no man in the land does aught to stay it. That is the law. From its horns to its hoofs, every hair of it is sacred. Bel-Ar may forgive me the loss of Ephadium, though it will be a great vexation to him, but the death of one of these sacred bulls of Shamar he will not forgive any man. Sooner might you expect mercy if you declared yourself a follower of the Goddess Glorian of Ruthar. In this matter I cannot hope to persuade him. By the bones of the 10,000 kings, I am sorry that this thing has happened."
But later, as they rode on toward the city of Adlaz, the Red Captain seemed to be far from rueful. He rode behind the car, and, when he thought none was observing him, he smiled to himself, as though the course of events were taking pleased him very well indeed.